Just a quick reminder that each presentation has been assigned 20 minutes plus 10 minutes of Q&A, and I will be reminding you 5 minutes before your presentation is left, then 2 minutes before the presentation is left, and I will be controlling the time, right? Thank you so much. The floor is yours, Marianne.
Thank you very much. So just trying to access my presentation. Let me know how it looks at your end, because probably at some point I will lose track of what you can see.
We can see your screen right now.
Brilliant. Okay. Well, this is a big topic, so I'm going to try to condense some key ideas that I think are worth mentioning in very few minutes. It serves a very long conversation at least. But as you can see, there are some important pillars that I would like to address in my presentation today. The most important one, I think, is the sustainable language teaching element of it. This poses questions to me personally, and I believe to colleagues the world perhaps, on how to become or how to be a sustainable language teaching on the face of, you could say, a crisis. You can name it in different ways. Some people name it or say, or given the name of ecocide. I think as a consequence brings a question for us practitioners, educators, in terms of our identity, questions who we are as teachers, who are we supposed to be or become on the face of very special times. And I think one of the ways in which we can actually shape perhaps this new identity we need to consider is by introducing this idea of decolonization and making decolonizing decisions in the context of our teaching, of our classrooms, and on our general practice as a whole. I want to bring, first of all, an image that I think captures this idea of crisis to some extent, at least. I think probably you are very familiar with the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change, having produced recently a very interesting report. But it has been on the news for years, really. And this comes from The Guardian. There are many places where you can find information on this, of course. I also include a tweet I made. I'm a Spanish, but it's there. And this is because it's only this year that apparently the IPCC and the IPBES, I'll tell you what that is. I don't know it by heart, but I have it written here. Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. They, for the first time, mouthful of a name, work together, started to work together. It takes a long time to collaborate, even among organizations where you would think it's kind of obvious that they should talk to each other. It was only recently that they started to find a way to do that. And it was on the news. As you can see, I captured that where it says scientists call for solving climate and biodiversity crisis together. Yeah, you would have thought this had been clear for a long time. Collaboration is very important when you're facing a crisis, but apparently it takes a long time to actually gel into something tangible. But we can see in the quote that actually was issued by IPBES, how it is important that all parts of society come together to really create the path that we want to see happening. So I think that also includes us educators, and that's one of my premises today. I think this is a way to frame what I believe is important to discuss. In terms of what it means for our classrooms, I want to start straight away just showing a little bit of the possibilities that we have, the power of the decision-making power we have in our classrooms. I think to some extent we can choose what to bring within the time and the place we have for our students to learn a language. We may choose to make things that are not normally visible, voices that are not normally heard, be heard. And the question is how much of that we're doing and which of these voices we're going to choose to make more accessible. But I don't think there's a question as whether we should or shouldn't, and maybe later we come back to this point again. This is about indigenous communities in Ecuador facing a situation where there was an oil spillage that affected a big river, an important river in the area, and they live on the river, and they are very much victims of this situation. This is just an example of how I'm kind of cutting through all the different materials I produced for me to tackle this within my language teaching context. But you can see these indigenous people appear again, and I'm trying to capture some of the problems they are facing, and of course linked to my teaching of language. Language is still important. I have to focus on the subjunctive, and I have to create situations where my students can actually practice the language as well, but linked to this particular topic. So they are silenced. These communities, they are not protected. Really, the companies are protected. They haven't cleaned the river. So I want my students to express wishes connected to this plight they're facing. But also I want to make them aware that as citizens, and that's another aspect of my talk today, they have some form of agency. And maybe we can be very critical about social media, but it also is a platform, I think, to make voices heard and people being seen. So I think we can make a good use of these platforms, and we can invite our students to see them as something positive where they have this agency that sometimes is frustrating not to have when we are really tackling crisis or facing knowing about problems elsewhere in the world. Of course, subjunctive is still an issue for us. We need to learn to revise what it takes to put the subjunctive together. So this is not detracting from the linguistic aspect of the teaching, but it's really not the focal point in the sense that we are trying to communicate, we are trying to learn about some communities beyond our normal environment, and actually to some extent empathize, develop understanding and knowledge about their situation. Because I think we need to make a decision in terms of what we consider important, not only for us as teachers, but also for our students for the future. Knowledge brings some form of caring and some form of awareness that if we are not facilitating it, our students are deprived of, and they don't necessarily understand then the link between perhaps the learning and the Sustainable Development Goals. My students didn't know what these were. They didn't know there were 17 of them. And I think it's important for us to guide them into making connections, not only across the world, but also in terms of concepts, ideas, and values. And I think it's better that somebody else speaks at this point and maybe captures some of the reasons why I think this is important. So here we go, a little short video.
Why does it matter though? Why do names matter? Why does being able to tell the difference? Why does it matter though? Why do names matter? Why does being able to tell the difference between a starling and a blackbird, or between a cherry tree and a hawthorn tree matter? It matters because we're losing nature as well as the names for nature in this country. We've got more than 50% of species in decline. If starlings going, skylarks going, we've got newts going, hedgehogs. Names, good names, used, help us see, and they help us care. We find it hard to love what we cannot give a name to, and what we do not love, we will not save.
So I would like you to stay a bit for a moment with these two main ideas, names, and I think we could say also narrative stories help us see, and help the motivation behind my choosing certain topics, certain contexts for the language teaching I'm making, and also because see this connection. It's important to name things, to know about them, to have the stories for it, because then we can love, we can care, we can save, we can action some bits of our capacity that we have for agency can be directed into situations and things that if we don't know about, we would not do anything about. So this is important, and we are not the only ones capable of doing that. Of course, in the spectrum of language possibilities and action, we have scholars such as Michael Cronin, already also very much interested in this idea of eco-translation and the Anthropocene and what it means for us as language practitioners in different fields. and I captured this quote because I really like this idea of he puts forward of human exceptionalism as really being at the core of this belief we have that we can simply, look at everything we do in terms of disconnected from our environment, nature, as something to do with efficiency, instead of perhaps actually what perhaps is more the case, being ruthlessly destroying our environment, our context, and breaking this relationship we have with the land, and all the consequences it has for us, basically, and characterizes perhaps this Western culture of ours, is creating an ecological failure. And the irony of it is that the Earth is not at risk, really, or the planet, in fact. The Earth is going to be fine. We are not going to be fine. So we have to consider that we need to act, we need to make decisions, and we need to align these decisions so that actually we can have an impact, a positive one, for the future, for the children, for those who have no agency, perhaps, or very little agency, and they are victims of decisions made elsewhere and a long time ago as well. So we have seen different ways of approaching the topic. I've just captured a few of them. Some of them will be gearing us towards considering the adaptation as the way forward. Others are a bit gloomy in the take and presenting why the civilization is finished. Of course, there's lots of activists involved in fighting for solutions for the problems we have. And of course, a colleague of mine is difficult to ignore his efforts as well, has been very much involved with making a case for us to change the way we approach things. So there's a lot of, there's a big movement, I think, in very different disciplines. Rupert comes from philosophy. Other people come from other disciplines to consider critically what we're doing. Here we have, I'm jumping again back to the classroom, and I sometimes use materials that come from books, less and less these days, I must say. There's a big improvement in the kinds of things we have access now to. America now features quite prominently in books that have been produced for the language classroom. Before it was just a kind of footnote, but I still find there's a gap that has to be bridged here. We are doing well in the sense that we have now visibility for some designers coming from America, but still I feel there's something missing. And I think as a proposition, we can always definitely consider what is that we can do to make up for the missing bits that maybe are good. This is a start. Shouldn't necessarily stay here. There are some more things connected to fashion and clothing, the topic of clothing in our classrooms. So why not expand, adapt, add to what we are given, and have also agency in our expanding the topic and bringing other voices into the classroom and other issues like cultural appropriation, for example, for this particular instance. Other disciplines, as I say, very actively reconsidering individuals within disciplines are reconsidering the role they are playing in society. The same I would suggest we should be doing, of course. And here we have the late Polly Higgins, a barrister who redesigned her career to become a lawyer for the earth. Even though we are saying the earth is not at risk in a way, she was also interested in recovering the relationship we have with the earth, of course, and wanted to name ecocide as one of the international crimes that should be considered as a crime. Interesting, I think, here to highlight that she was creating a non-profit, not-for-profit organization, Ecological Defense Integrity, which basically gathered lots of different colleagues that were prepared to work for free or pro bono basis to support this cause. So there is this type of altruism that maybe we have to consider as well when it comes to looking at our practices and how we can modify them to align them with perhaps our values and find a way of agency there. She's going to tell us a bit about the implications of ecocide in a very short video here.
An area better known as Lapland, Sweden, I think, is a particularly interesting thing because they also have an indigenous culture there that's under threat, the Sami. And here within Europe, we have an indigenous culture still living off the land, where the land really matters to them, and they're now being threatened with super mining, major mining that could destroy vast tracts of their territory. And this is an opportunity to direct those individuals whose land is under threat, whose way of living with their land is under threat. So this is the cultural ecocide.
So I let this knocking at the door to our consciousness as well, perhaps as a kind of metaphor of the kinds of considerations we have to make. And there is this cultural ecocide, which of course brings linguistic ecocide and so on. So we have to consider which ways we can bring change to our classrooms, because it has implications for an area that we care about, which is culture, which is language. And there are different ways to do it. You can do it in a very superficial way. We can approach geographically a region that we are normally not tackling and not seeing in our classrooms. We can learn about the geographical considerations, locations, features. We can go deeper and still bring these typical topics we tend to cover in languages, which have to do with hotel reservations and booking tables and food, perhaps landscape, perhaps excursions. We can get to pay attention to the locals a little bit, their crafts, their interesting clothing, talk about colors. But we can go a bit deeper and then find about their customs. We find then that the Tarahumara people in northern Mexico, in Chihuahua, are great runners. Some people have written books about them and made films about them, which is a way to get closer to them. But is that all there is to this? Some spin-off of all this knowledge in terms of making this cultural element, which is the special shoe they run with. Is it cultural appropriation again? Is it good? Is it bad to bring this into the world in this way? Or shall we go back and dig deeper and find impact that it has for crops? Does it mean to lose 58% of your crops? What are the consequences? How indigenous people are mobilized, activists speaking up for the communities, sometimes threatened. You have here long videos. We need collaboration across countries, even teachers getting together to actually adapt this material, because it's very valuable. It has a lot of information that is very good, but it does take time to tackle this. Going back to this loss of crops and the implications, this is coming from El País newspaper. So as a Spanish speaker from Spain, probably I have very, very good access to this information as opposed to all the people in my classrooms, other students outside Spain. So is it my responsibility to tell them about it? Why would I do that? And I think we need to consider what happens when communities already in real time now are facing the consequences of climate change or climate crisis. They lose their crops and then they are forced to migrate. What are the implications for the children? They lose on education. They live in very difficult conditions. Poverty is an issue. Losing contact with the communities is an issue. And we go back to this biocultural extinction and this linguistic threatening conditions as well that we should make a case for protecting. So I'm going very quickly because there's a lot here that I cannot dwell on. And I'm going to go quickly on the concept of what can we then become apart from the idea of a teacher we maybe have always had. Can we add to that one concept of activism? Can we call ourselves something else? Champion, advocate, doesn't matter what we are called. Shouldn't we just focus on the fact that we should embrace, as Phipps and Guillermo argue, a critical pedagogy that actually makes clear that we cannot be neutral and we have to be committed to some extent to a moral and political struggle. So in terms of politics, I think quickly also I should remind you that, of course, this idea, this word comes from polis, city. This generates this other concept person from the police. And Michael Byram himself has actually explored this idea and sort of developed or dwelt on the fact that we can ignore the dimension, the political dimension that the language learner and the language teacher has, the responsibility that comes with it. We are interested in developing human capital, international citizenship, critical learners that fits into being good citizens. He draws from the sources to actually make the case that in another way, we can also make a case that the education system as a whole across disciplines should actually, as he has been argued before him, feed into the politische Bildung, the making citizens actually through the process of learning different content. But the contribution of languages is that it adds this reflexive or reflective dimension that is very much needed. So we have a big role to play, I think, in this political dimension we have. And when it comes to make decisions as for what we bring to our classrooms, of course, we can have this international standpoint, as Byron says, human rights, peace education. I would argue the Sustainable Development Goals is a very good framework to also explore topics that would link to that. And this brings us to potential cross-curricular cooperation. We can talk to other disciplines. We should actually not become or remain insular. We have to just find ways to become interdisciplinary, because I think we have a big vocation, a big potential for being interdisciplinary. And I think that's the way we can actually touch upon so many topics that are relevant today and we need to know about. Lots of resources out there to actually have a global vision and have access to data, which is very important in terms of deforestation, water, fires. This is a fantastic website, and there are many others that make us think beyond borders. We cannot stay with the national border. I think that's another proposition. Also borders in terms of our classrooms. We have to open our classrooms. I have tried that with creating web pages because I had reasons for it. I wanted to be flexible. I wanted to, address diversity, be collaborative, and certainly intercultural and creative, because I thought that that could be sustainable. But there are so many other ways to be sustainable. I think collaboration is one. My students collaborate with me, but I think us as a community of educators should think about how we can work together, because it does take time to produce resources. Students contribute to the resources. You can take them as one of those people that have to be also visible, become visible in our teaching. And they become visible if you have the right platform for it. But also our work has to become visible, I think, and shareable and committed to collaboration. Use that surplus, cognitive surplus we all have. And we have to think ourselves as volunteers as well. And I think that the top-down solutions are not good enough when we are tackling these changes. We need also some form of grassroots movement, and that's what I'm proposing today. So the Sustainable Teaching Net is out there. It's even waiting to be populated, and I would love to hear from you. Thank you very much. Looking forward to your questions. If we have time for questions, I'm not sure. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Marianne, for such an interesting and thought-provoking presentation. We have 5 more minutes for Q&A. So I think we have time for one question. I'm really sorry we kind of took 5 minutes from this session, but I'm pretty sure that there are some comments or questions from the audience. Maybe Manuela Wagner?
Oh, thank you. You're calling on me. That's nice. I've been very, very interested in this presentation. Thank you very much, Marianne. So yeah, and colleagues and I have been working on exactly this topic actually for a long time. And so it's wonderful to see the synergy, and I'd love to touch base sometime. And actually Mike Byram, Fabiana Cardetti, a mathematics professor, and I published a book on interdisciplinary units on which we collaborated, and they have to do with sustainability quite a bit and other human rights. So I'd love to chat offline as well.
Yeah, there's a lot of work already. I think you know, in a way, many of us are already plugged in that direction, but perhaps the call is the call for attention, perhaps in a way implicit in this presentation, is for those who are not yet sure which way to go and hesitating, and of course fairly so, because it is time consuming to change gears, to reconsider, reconceptualize your practice when you have been doing things very differently, and it feels comfy and it works, you know, to some extent. It's very difficult to change that, and I acknowledge that it takes a lot of time. But together is easier, and especially I believe the sharing of resources is quite important, because we all time starving many times, and we need to support each other in these sort of values that, you know, we want to see taking shape in the classroom and beyond. I would argue.
Really enjoyed the examples you showed.
Yeah, sorry that it was so quick, but
Marianne,
I tried
we
my
have
best.
a question in the chat box by Denise. Denise says, thank you. It is a very interesting topic and pedagogical experience. I just want to ask, is there a selection of materials and topics done by the teacher, or all these materials come from students' interests and research ideas?
It's a mixture. It's true that to begin with, I brought items to the classroom as prompts, and also sometimes it is complicated to adapt material out there to make it fit within the time you have, within the topics you want to cover, linguistically speaking. So you cannot leave everything to the students, but I think you can model a certain practice and a certain way of thinking. And then you can, once you get started there, then you can actually ask for the students to take initiative and direct them in ways in which they can actually bring things to the classroom. And I think they become very sensitized to the topics, and they see the points. Actually, they value all the, I haven't included the evaluations, but the evaluations are very positive in the sense that they say, yeah, we understand why these topics are so important, and it's very good that we have covered them. So I think that's worth keeping in mind from the perspective of the students.
Yeah, absolutely.
So yeah, they can be collaborators indeed. Yeah.
Yeah. We have 2 minutes left, and by Jane.
Hello,
Jane
thank you very much. That was really interesting.
Jane, yeah.
Can you?
Yeah.
Marianne, and I completely agree with you. No political position is a political position in itself. You can't argue, you know, to not take one. And it's lovely to hear how engaged the students have been. I'm thinking about, have you also got evidence that you could offer about students' language learning that they managed to achieve in your class, that you could argue, who says that you're using up too much time on other things and not language?
Well, some of the things I included, just glimpses of it really, in these bubble speeches were produced by the students. It went through a process of editing, but we talked about the grammar and the little mistakes that sometimes they were there. So it gives us opportunity. It produces material that is very much contextualized for the work that we do in class, but at the same time, it's actually very transportable for other platforms. I think that's the beauty of it. You don't have to do an extra bit of work. It comes within the classroom. It gives us opportunity to work language with language, and then an output that can be shared and can be prompting other students. And actually it can be integrated in the language learning in that way. So maybe that doesn't really show very much the process of getting to that endpoint. But there has been this process of prompting the students engaging with each other, producing texts, and then going over those texts and commenting on the language. In that particular case, that was kind of the process in a nutshell. It's about producing phrases, shorter input. But it gives you, I think the students actually, what I want to go back to is that there's a fear that, of course, because you have to introduce sometimes some new ideas, it can detract from the language, but I think the motivation is actually quite important. So if you capture with the storytelling the imagination of your students, they're going to be able to be prepared to put the time then to respond to that and use the language. It's a bit of a difficult balance, but it can be negotiated, I think. Thank you.
Thank you once again, Marianne, for such an interesting presentation. Big round of applauses, virtual applauses for you. And let me introduce the second presentation of the day, Culture and Gender, an attempt at decolonizing theoretical positions, by Jane Wooden from University of Sheffield in the UK. Lina Hamaidia from the University of Sheffield as well, and by Sarah Methvin as an independent researcher. The floor is all yours.
Great, thank you very much. Can you? Okay, yes. Yeah, greatly. Elena, if you want to put your, oh, you've done it, lovely. Okay then, so I think I'm going to share the screen. Let me try this one. Does this work? Can we see that? Can you see my slides okay? Yeah?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, thank you. That's great. Here we go. So our presentation today then, we're going to be doing 3 short interventions. We wanted enough time to have conversations with you as well, and you'll see that our work is basically a result of conversations which the 3 of us have been having. It's not a finished and completed presentation, and you won't find quite as many lovely pictures as you did in Marianne's, but hopefully the ideas are really, really important. We've got Sarah from an international development perspective, and Lena and myself, who both work at the University of Sheffield. Sarah's going to start with a story.
Hi. Let's start with a short story about my experience from working in Mozambique in the early 90s, just after the end of the war. And I was part of a project research team that was working with communities using participatory methodologies to help them work out what they wanted to change in their lives and in their livelihoods at that time. The example I've chosen, it could have been any example, but this, and so during the research process, we very often had separate groups of men and women, quite often had at least 2 languages, usually Portuguese and the local language of Makua being used. But in the conversation about chickens and how they care for the chickens and the value they attach to it. And one of the things that they said very clearly was, for them, the value was not necessarily monetary, but it was useful. The chickens were useful as a bartering tool, both with traditional healers. People wouldn't go to the traditional healers without a chicken, and also to exchange for other foods in the hungry season. We talked a little bit about chickens in the marketplace, and the response to that was, men take the chicken to the market, and we don't know how much chickens get when they go to market. So this led us down another route. Can't go to the market. We discussed the barriers, what stops them going to the market, and what stops them knowing about the market value of chickens. We discussed the different roles of men and women and the different power they have in the decisions about how many chickens go to market, etc. How the benefits from the marketing of chickens might be used. And again, focused on what, if anything, they would like to change. As we unpacked the kind of gendered roles of chicken production and chicken marketing, this made visible the inequality in the effort versus the benefits between men and women, especially around who controls the resources. So at this stage, I can say the women were not jumping up saying, well, we must go to market. They were still very careful about that as one of the changes that they wanted. But what I felt was the conversation was a trigger. It was a trigger for the team that I was working with to talk to the men about chickens in the market and how they might do things differently about sharing the benefits of that. But it also became a point of reference for future conversations with the women about how they might like to see things change. So, so when it comes to decolonizing, I believe we have to go beyond looking at the roles and the resources and think about how we might decolonize gender. And as you can imagine, in the development sector, there is an enormous amount of discussion from academics and practitioners about decolonizing the development project. Some will take, and the views are very much on a continuum, and some will take the view that it cannot be done, that development is a continuation of the colonizing project and it just can't be decolonized. And that is one end of the continuum of views. The view that I've chosen to share with you today is from Andrea Cornwall, who gave a talk in 2017. And she suggested that there are ways in which we can decolonize gender in the development process. And her argument was that it involves us taking a renewed focus on the processes of unlearning and critical consciousness building that makes the injuries of the colonial, patriarchal, and heteronormativity visible, and recognition of those who are marginalized because of it. And her suggestions were that processes that can make more visible and explore lived experience are central to this, as well as using power analysis, which has always been central to the discussions of gender. So her first view is it's about empowerment, about understanding how those who are subordinated and marginalized can redefine their lives instead of being disciplined by development agencies, narratives, and interventions. In practice, this means helping women understand what gets in the way of them making decisions, what gets in the way of them accessing resources. By visibilizing social differences, discrimination, it allows an opportunity to discuss change. It helps people understand their own power within, their power to act, and their power with others, and ultimately the power to change. The second area that Andrea mentioned was emplacement, and this was about directing attention to people's lived experience in their context, rather than seeing them as statistics, or rather than seeing that there is a blueprint solution for every problem out there. It's important to take a historical view on these contexts, understanding how colonialism has the development effects, either health and education, etc., is to a large extent a colonial import. The final E that she talks about is encroachment, and I think this is the message that links more strongly with the ideas of intercultural communication studies regarding the need to interrogate culture and translation as a social political practice. And this is to encourage practitioners to be conscious of how their own development agencies and narratives have continued the colonial practices and encroached on people's integrity by imposing patriarchal and heteronormative assumptions. So from my position as a practitioner, it is a reminder of the critical need for development facilitators to be reflective practitioners, to examine your own role in the processes that you're facilitating, to know your own power within those processes, to regularly check your assumptions, what knowledge is valued in a discussion and by whom is it valued, how language influences the conversation and who gets to speak, being an active listener, and finally, embracing complexity, uncovering differences through talking to people about their lived experiences, intersectionality between men and women, but also between women and women.
So I'd like to look at this notion of decolonisation and gender in relation to feminism, and by drawing a parallel between the situation of minorities and also the situation of women in patriarchal society. So, and the use of language is very important in this, because just as it reveals inequalities between cultures, it also reveals inequalities between men and women in society. And so I'd like to start by considering the influence of the feminist analysis of language on the way language develops. And theorists going back to the 1970s right up to the present day, feminist theorists have used a deterministic view that the use of language, use of sexist language, constructs and maintains social inequality. Sorry, I've gone. Jane, is it possible to go back, please? Thank you. The deterministic view that the use of sexist language constructs and maintains social inequalities between men and women. So just a very well-known example is the use of the word he as a generic term, which has been used, which was used for a long time, and particularly used, I would say, in the Bible. And it was described by Spender, Dale Spender, as a sexist linguistic structure, in that it was a convenient way of making women invisible. And this feminist critique of language, I think, is very important because it encourages to reappraise how we use language and how we take for granted the language we use, and then to rethink it. And the feminist critique of language, through this, the practice of using the generic he is largely obsolete today, I would say, and being replaced by inclusive terms such as they. And I think this is a good example of the way strategies can be developed to make women be visible in language. And I think visibility is a theme that we're all pursuing today and examining. And basically, the idea of making women visible through a considered use of language, I think we can compare that to, as Marianne was saying in her presentation as well, the need to make minority cultures visible. And this can be challenged through translation. And so the point I'm trying to make and like to argue is that translation itself can be used as a tool of decolonization to make disempowered people, whether it's in a sense of gender or in a sense of minority cultures, to make them visible. So, as we've said, the deterministic view of the use of language suggests that language perpetuates social inequalities between men and women. And this also applies to translation, which it also gives us an opportunity to challenge this. And the way that we make translation decisions, which is based on ethical considerations, means that translation is now becoming a form of social practice, and it can be used to resist the perpetuation of inequalities between cultures. Feminist translators take a very politically activist view of translation. And as Baker says, feminist politics understands translation as a never neutral or innocent act of disinterested mediation, but rather as a more important means of producing identities, knowledges, and cross-cultural encounters. So I've chosen one example today to illustrate how feminist approach to translation can actually be used as a form of political activism. And this is a project which was known as the Global Feminisms Project, which was set up by Paz and Zaborowska to examine the use of interventionist feminist translation strategies in some English translations of interviews conducted across a variety of languages, none of which were the predominant global English. And in order to approach this translation from a feminist perspective, the translators rejected what Spivak termed the assimilationist translation practice, which is very similar to Venuti's notion of domestication, in that it tries to make the source text accessible to the target culture, and in doing so, it hides difference, you could say. And so in that sense, gender and the minority culture of the writer is smoothed over in this kind of approach to translation. And participants in the Global Feminisms Project were advocating an anti-assimilationist approach to translation, which could be parallel to Venuti's foreignization strategy. And this approach challenges global inequalities and the imbalance in the number of texts translated from dominant languages in comparison with minority languages, at the same time as it makes the female more visible. So the strategies that we used in this project made both the gender and the culture of the source text writers more visible. And one example of a type of feminist strategy which was used is supplementation. And so when the text was being translated, the translator would add explanations in brackets, provide further clarification, provide references. And this type of strategy disrupts the flow of the narrative, it interferes with the flow of the narrative, and it draws attention to the presence of the translator and the issues that the translator was trying to draw attention to. So this is one example. This use of feminist translation strategies in this particular project is one example of a way that translation can be used to resist and to even out inequalities, and to recognize different backgrounds, different cultures, and to demonstrate there are differences between the experience of, for example, an American feminist and someone from a minority culture.
Thank you, Lena. So I'm going to now bring us into the kind of intercultural communication aspect of it as well, and have a look at kind of culture and gender as two problematic concepts. We will probably all in this room agree that both gender and culture are socially constructed, so built by society, built by our interactions, maintained by our institutions, and reified, made to feel like real. In the World Health Organization definition of gender, they talk about gender as socially constructed. UNESCO describes culture as a kind of set of features which can be spiritual or physical or intellectual, emotional, etc., which are shared among a group. In both of these cases, there is a large sense of culture and gender then as being something which is constructed, as Ulf Hannertz says when he kind of boils down culture to equal meaning. Meaning can then be contested, managed, dominated, and exposed. So we can recognize this as researchers in both kind of intercultural communication studies and in translation as well. And when we're looking at the question of gender, that we're talking about social constructs. So we will often position ourselves then against what we call essentialism, against assuming that we can know someone else because we know their culture, or against what Cornwall talks about, against essentialist framings of gender, which deny the flexibility of people's sexualities. They constrain and fix people. It's the same argument in intercultural studies. And we would generally agree then that these kind of essentializations ignore the complexity of culture and gender identifications, and that we can't predict behavior of human beings on these large imagined groups. So then we move from researching culture as something which is static to understanding how culture and gender is used in certain contexts and for what purposes. However, in doing so, in undertaking our research, we find that large culture or gender constructs actually have power in the world. They open doors and they close them. People who are aligned to certain nationalities in a kind of big political sense have access to countries or not. They are denied passports. They have freedoms that go with that. And in the Black Lives Matter movement, we're not talking about culture equals nation, but culture equals ethnicity. And in many ways, people have exposed the kind of marginalization on lines of ethnicity. And these kind of large constructs actually have power, real power across the world, even though they're imagined. And some examples there on there about employment or marriage, custody rights, and even rights to the chicken market in the story, as Sarah was talking before. Those are sort of decided and maintained alongside these large culture gender constructs. So there's some reference there from Ladegaard and Jenks as well, who have recognized in one of the special issues of Language and Intercultural Communication that it's often the minority groups who experience these constructs as real, these big culture, big gender constructs, because they're often marginalized or unable to access certain things. And that raises the question then for us about what does this mean for our carefully crafted definitions of culture and gender? We've worked so hard in kind of research to arrive at a position, but people are living it differently. If we're going to decolonize perhaps our concepts themselves, and perhaps rather than needing to look for the best definition, we ought to look at the kinds of things which the School of Oriental and African Studies in London looks at when they're talking about decolonizing the curriculum. That we should look at our shared assumptions about how the world is, the relationship between the location and identity of the writer. You know, is it white, Western male academics who are defining our constructs of culture, or is it people who are experiencing it on a daily basis, and what should we do about that? Then thinking also about the implications of diversity. I'm aware we're short of time. I can't see the text because I'm sharing the screen. I can't see the comments, but I'll try and finish us there. I think I've more or less said. So just to summarize from all of us, really, I suppose, what we found in common that we're looking at are questions of complexity and bringing inequalities to the fore, and then questioning how we arrive at the concepts that we use to do our research work with, also in universities. And the point which came up through Marianne's presentation as well, about visibilizing and opening up processes and trying to look at things from a multi-perspective position and taking an activist approach to it, whether it's through the examples that Sarah gave at the beginning, or through the translation examples, or through what I've just said here. Okay, we'll stop there, but we'll take any comments or questions.
Thank you, Jane. Yes, we have 5 minutes for questions and answers. So if anybody has a question in the audience, this is the time. Either you raise your hand or you open your microphone directly, or you can also use the chat box. Okay, we have Juan Shan.
Hi, Jen. Hi, Lina. Nice to meet you too here. I have a question I actually prepared before, but I think I have another question now. How do you capture the inequality? Say, what kind of data you're looking for? Like in your data, how do you capture the moment that proves that the inequality exists? Only because I come from the background of conversation analysis, so I do look at because it relates to my previous question of sort of how do you operationalize like say cultural categorization is made irrelevant. I don't know whether that makes sense. Sorry.
Perhaps that's a really good question. I think it's a really good question. How in a kind of micro context can we see inequalities? I think that's what you're talking about there, isn't it? Well, from an intercultural perspective, I have found that Skolan and Skolan research approach about who raises whatever aspect it is you're interested in researching, for what in what context, for what purpose, and with what consequence, which can really help unpack what's happening in interactions. And I think there's a well, I won't go on because there's not much time, but I think that there's a lot that we can get out of that in micro contexts as well. I don't know if Lena has something to say about it from a translation perspective, because of course sometimes translations are visible, aren't they? Already on, there are examples which you can scrutinize. Is there anything you want to add, Lena? You have to put your mic on.
Sorry. Yes, I think that, that, as Jane said, that's a very good and interesting question. I think from the translation perspective, we're looking at this, for example, from the examples I've given, a culture which is a minority culture. It's not one of the, it's not the dominant American European culture. Then you might say, for example, in post-colonial literature, there's a definite attempt to make the minority peoples, like the kind of people that Marianne was also talking about, need to make their presence felt in the language. So I think it's making a distinction between the mainstream and the people who, whether it's women who are in a disempowered situation or the minority cultures, and to see how that is represented in language and what we can do in language to make these people more visible. So I think that's that's why I gave the very simple example of the generic he, which, as Spender says, actually encompasses the female within the male. So as I say, that's a simple example, but there's a lot of examples like that. So I think careful analysis of the way we use language and the way minorities are represented in language can be very useful. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Thank you once again, Lena, Jane, and Sarah, for this thought-provoking presentation. Big round of applause for you. And this brings us to the third and last presentation for this Parallel Room 3, which is using the concept of plurilingual competence to understand Bruneian university students' attitudes about their language use, by Sarah Boy from University Brunei, Jerusalem. So, Sarah, the floor is all yours.
Thank you. I hope everyone can hear me.
Yes, we can.
And can see my slides. Thank you for the two presentations, two conference papers that I've just listened to, both really, really interesting. And it's really nice to just be around people from around the world in this remote way. I'm on Borneo and it's 9:30 p.m. And I'm not used to to working at this time. I'm more of a 9 to 5 worker. I'm not very good in the evening. In fact, I'm a 6 a.m. worker. I'm an early bird. Anyway, I'm hoping that my slides are sort of tired proof, and I've written them in everything in clearly. Oh, except I'm on the wrong slide. So clearly not. Hang on. Okay, clearly not. Right, here we go. So I'm trying to draw some parallels or sort of find some connection from the last talk to mine. It's actually not that easy, but I think this, what I'm going to talk about is just an example of a very local example of examining language use among speakers in a very different and distinct locality in Brunei. And yeah, it's presenting a study that we've done at the Language Centre where I work, and the ideas about plurilingualism and plurilingual competence have emerged sort of alongside the study. So it's very much come through inductively through our data. We started off looking at EMI, English medium instruction, and wanted to try to explore the students' attitudes to having their university education in English in this country, and I'll show some context of the study, because we've had studies that have looked at the lecturers' attitudes of using EMI, local lecturers, international lecturers, so on, and there was a real obvious starting point to actually look at the students' attitudes. So we picked that up. So that's the basis of the study, but where it's led me on my journey is really understanding in a completely different way this notion of plurilingualism, which I first came across working in Munich at the university, the LMU University, where I worked for many years before I came to Brunei. And it was in relation to the CEFR documents and so on, and to my studies in intercultural language education. But my understanding of plurilingualism has changed significantly, being in Asia, being in Southeast Asia, being on Borneo, and hopefully this talk can share some of those growing concepts with the audience. Okay, so that's the abstract, which is in the proceedings, and I will stick as closely as possible to the abstract. So we'll look at these concepts, and again, I've just broken. I've written them in very simply, but I've added thoughts where we can maybe in the question and answers have a chance to explore things in a bit more detail. But just starting off with where I started from, as I suppose, when I first encountered these concepts. So understanding that multilingualism is referring more to a geographical area rather than an individual speaker or any speech act, where there's more than one variety of language. I mean, I don't find that concept problematic. I think it can describe a geographical situation, but it doesn't really help us when it comes to language users and language speakers and what they're actually doing. So that's why I was always grateful for the idea of plurilingualism, referring to not the language itself, but to the speakers. So the repertoire of the different varieties of a language, or different distinct languages as we understand them, or as they're defined, that individuals use. And in the Council of Europe and the CEFR, it's opposed to monolingualism, but that's something that I could question. But yeah, so there's this idea that there's many languages to varying degrees of ability, but someone's plurilingual competence can encompass their whole linguistic repertoire. And in that sense, I'll move straight on in the spirit of time to my thoughts on that, because if we think of a language user as having this repertoire, which includes words, what we classically call loan words in English, for example, from other countries, you know, yoga from Sanskrit or whatever. So, you know, where these boundaries are drawn, where do we draw the line and say this person is a monolingual speaker, is entirely political and arbitrary. So in a sense, it's hard to say that there's such a thing as a monolingual speaker as opposed to a plurilingual speaker. I think it's probably more helpful to imagine speaker is a plurilingual speaker. And I think in my next slide, that's something that's come to my acute attention here more than in Western Europe, certainly more than in the UK, where I'm from, is that in most and many parts of the world, multilingualism and the use of multiple languages in one speech act, translanguaging and so on, is completely and utterly unremarkable. And that's probably one of the most interesting, well, something that I ponder on a lot, is this idea that what a lot of people in some parts of the world, Western Europe or America as examples, consider to be a very remarkable thing, is actually quite unremarkable, that using different languages to varying, that you have some degree of is unremarkable. Such yes, so the idea of bahasa, which is a Malay word in Indonesia and Malay, which means, well, it's often interpreted and translated to mean language. So bahasa Melayu is the Malay language, bahasa Indonesia is the Indonesian language. And then, but the more I discuss language ideas, language use with my colleagues here, the more I realize, and this is what I found very interesting about the keynote speech yesterday, the first keynote speech, is that came up there as well, and it really resonated with my own thoughts, is that bahasa is a much richer and more difficult to pin down concept than just a language. It can refer to language or languages or communication in various non-verbal and verbal forms. And it certainly encompasses the idea of what we tend to call translanguaging now. So so that's what's where my thoughts are, and I'm really interested to hear from people when we get to talk about this in a few minutes. Okay, I'll crack on. So translanguaging then in this context, using a common definition from America about this idea of using a full linguistic repertoire, it's clear that translanguaging and plurilingual competence have got a lot in common. So translanguaging is someone's ability to deploy their full linguistic repertoire without having to adhere to socially or politically defined language or so on. So these ideas have come into sharp focus in the studies that we're involved in at the University Brunei Darussalam, where I work. So as I said, we started off just thinking on a much more straightforward, as often research projects do. You start thinking, oh, this is very straightforward. We're just going to look at students' attitudes to EMI. Pearson has talked about EMI as a policy without a plan, whereas I would say here in Malaysia and Borneo, Brunei, Indonesia, the Southeast Asia, it's probably more accurate to understand it as a plan without a policy. At our university, there's nothing written down. There's no shift to EMI recently that you can see in other parts of the world. English has always been the language of formal education as long as formal education has existed in Brunei, and there have been Malay bilingual education in up to secondary school, and then post-secondary school has always been a much stronger emphasis on English, but fully bilingual education, as we'll see in a minute. So EMI, it has an historic precedence here. It's certainly pragmatic because of the linguistic diversity of the students and staff. At the Language Centre here, we teach not just Asian languages as foreign languages, Korean, Mandarin, Japanese. We teach European languages as well, and we do all our EAP courses are through the Language Centre for English, but we also teach some Borneo languages, which are spoken, some of them are only spoken in this tiny area of Brunei, such as Dusun. Iban is a much more widely documented and spoken language and has radio stations and newspapers and print and so on, but there are lots of languages which are quite distinct from Iban, from Malay, Dusun, Bidayu, that are not written or only marginally written, and we do try teach them here. We teach Dusun, for example, which is a Bruneian Dusun. There is another Dusun in Sabah, which is the Malaysian state to the north of us. But there's certainly an historic precedence for EMI here, and again, it's unremarkable. So this sort of explosion around the rest of the world you can't trace it as it being sort of mirrored here. It's something that's always happened here since the existence of universities in Brunei, and UBD is the oldest university established in 1985. Right, this is some of the literature that's from the region which feeds into this, and please do contact me if you want to get the references that are too quick in these slides, and then I'll just very briefly take you through the study. So English is used from primary schools onwards, bilingual education. Malay is used just for Malay studies, and then civics and religious education, and also Arabic is learned in religious education. UBD has always been a bilingual university, and in the last decade it's definitely become more English centric and English heavy. The requirements for English in order to enter are now higher in terms of the IGCSE or the GCSE or O-level that they do here. The grade has to be higher, and even if students are studying Malay literature and Malay language, they still have to have an English requirement, which is a new thing. Okay, so we asked 241 of our first year students just a questionnaire responding to certain statements mainly. This represents about a quarter of the intake. There's normally about 1,000 in a new cohort, and predominantly the first language that people identified was Malay, with a few exceptions: English, Chinese, especially Hokkien dialect here, and some interesting statements that show here, and I'll just summarize them again in a minute, is how comfortable the students are using English in their modules, despite considering their first language to be Malay. comfortable with using English and comfortable using English with Bruneian and expatriate lecturers. There's about a 60-40, 40 international staff and 60 Malay local staff, Malay and Chinese. What's interesting here is to show their sort of comfort in using a mix of languages and translanguaging or shifting, the high percentage that say that disagree with the statement that they only use English with their Bruneian lecturers, and also the high percentage that agree that they mix both English and Malay with their Bruneian lecturers. So even when they're speaking to Bruneian lecturers who presumably would be classified as Malay first language speakers, as they are, they agree that they don't use only Malay, they use English and Malay, because the mixing of languages when people speak both languages through the bilingual education system and so on is quite normal and unremarkable. And then a few more statements that I've got here just in the last few minutes. So what's interesting here is that how acceptable the students find it that Bruneian lecturers mix Malay or other languages in a so-called English medium class. Nearly 70% find that totally acceptable. They're comfortable with using English, although slightly fewer of them find it easy, but still 55.8% there. And then the other interesting thing here is a low percentage of respondents who would prefer it if their lecturers taught only in Malay, even though most of the respondents identify Malay as their first language, but only a small percentage would prefer Malay. They're comfortable with English, using English with Bruneian and expatriate lecturers from all around the world, not just European, and so on. So what struck us when we were looking at this data was just how unremarkable the mixing, translanguaging, and sort of comfort of that was. And that's where I started thinking about these concepts of plurilingualism and so on. But thinking about the implications of this for pedagogy regarding the comfort and ease with which students have plurilingual repertoires, and I think it really relates to a further distancing from the idea of target language only in academic EMI settings as a way to achieve better language or content outcomes. So this idea of EMI without any reference to a home language, like Japan or somewhere else in Asia, where there is much more of a defined shared national language, however much of a construct that is, and how difficult it is for lecturers to use a target language if there's a shared first language. But that's not even the context that we're dealing with here. But what I think it points to is that if the pedagogy ignores this plurilingual language use and competence, then there's a greater likelihood that students are going to disengage from the learning because they're being put in very much a false linguistic environment for them. So that's what's come out of it for me. And just at the bottom of this slide, before I finish, a recent study on Bruneian secondary school students with a student on a postgraduate student here. He did an interesting study with looking at process writing in the classroom with school children here. And he had a group that only used English, as is the norm, for all stages of the planning the writing, planning the everything to do, and then actually doing the product writing. And then he had another group who were planning and they were allowed to use Malay, and they were encouraged to use Malay, or to sort of not be restricted in that sense. Obviously the outcome was still an English piece of writing, but it was the pieces of writing, when looked at by different teachers within the English department, there was a higher, the ones that have been planned without restricting the language were generally considered to be better pieces of work. So that for me is a very significant finding, and I think that study needs to be replicated, I think, and that's something that we're hoping to do, or to certainly sort of build from that. So just to finish, I definitely think that plurilingualism best describes Bruneian speakers, the students that I work with every day. And I think that examining and trying to find pedagogical approaches which are plurilingual are likely to lead to higher learner engagement and better learning outcomes. And I think focusing specifically on the engagement is where I'd want to go next. So that's where I am at the moment. So some references there, and please do contact me if you want any more references or you want to talk further. And hopefully there is some time for some questions and comments and thoughts. So I'll look forward to hearing from you now.
Yes, Sarah, absolutely. Thank you very much, first of all, for this insightful presentation. We have 9 minutes for questions and answers from the audience or from the other presenters. Comments are also welcome. Let me see. So, okay, so Manuela Wagner, I think you open the camera.
Does it mean when I open the camera that I want to speak? I'm sorry, I just wanted to, because we're all together now.
That's exactly what I want to know as well.
Oh, I apologize.
I don't know if, no, I thought that you may be.
I do have a question later, but I want to leave the floor to others. Sorry about that.
Okay, no problem. So if we have any questions for Sarah, this is the moment. Okay, so let's go with Manuela.
Okay, if nobody goes, I'm happy to go. Thank you so much for this presentation, Sarah. I'm so happy with this panel. So thank you, all the presenters and organizers. Sarah, my question pertains to your work in terms of languages and student engagement. I think that's a really interesting direction, and I'm wondering if you also looked into the students' attitudes of the languages, you know, English versus Malay, and also student comfort, not only with the language itself, but what it means to their identity when these languages are used. Did you poke a little bit in this direction as well?
Well, yeah, thank you for that question. We didn't really. It was a big, you know, questionnaire study, and it's not the methodology that really is good for that sort of thing, and that's why there's so much we can do from it now. It's really opened up so many ideas, and I'm really interested in that idea of identity projection that you mentioned. And I think, you know, a conversation or discourse analysis could really lend itself to exploring that, you know, thinking in terms of the things that Claire Cramch has done, looking at speakers in California with indigenous Central American languages and in Spanish and English. I think that's the sort of thing that resonates with me here when I see, you know, there's Filipino, Tagalog being used with Malay, with English, with an indigenous Borneo language, all in one utterance, and it's absolutely fascinating. And being able to use, you know, conversation or discourse analysis to try and unpack why did they say that word, and why didn't they use the word in this language? And, you know, that's for me where I'm really interested in going, and actually getting some transcripts, some natural speech and natural conversation. So yeah, I think that's exactly what we're hoping to do next.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. I was going to ask something similar. I mean, have you explored what kind of identities they prefer to enact in one language or in the other. I mean, given that they are proficient in many languages and they say they feel comfortable using all of these languages, do you think that they have, you know, like different preferences towards what kind of identity they want to portray in one language or the other?
Yeah, I think so. And I mean, it's hard to say with I mean, I can give some anecdotal answers with colleagues when there's this Bahasa Malay is a sort of standard Malay that students here have to learn at school. And it's easy to assume that that's, you know, just like learning the language that they speak with their parents, but then just learning it at school. But actually it's nothing of the kind. It's very much hated because Brunei Malay is very, very different from Standard Malay, which is associated with the peninsula, which is on the other side of the South China Sea, and is really nothing to do with Borneo or Brunei. So people speak Brunei Malay and then they get to school, be taught in English, and then also learn Standard Malay. And it's very difficult, and and I think that's where you can see a lot of student disengagement right at the beginning of the educational journey. So I think I've seen colleagues who are, you know, studied in the UK, come back to Brunei, and somebody from overseas will speak to them in Standard Malay, assuming that they're doing the right thing, you know. So, you know, I'm not going to use English because it's so presumptive of me to use English as a lingua franca, and I'm going to use Malay. And then these very highly educated Bruneians stop dead in their tracks and think, why on earth is this person not speaking English to me when my English is near native, and I can't speak Standard Malay? And you see people panic, even though that, you know, they identify very much as Malay, but Brunei Malay in terms of language, and not what they call Standard Malay or Bahasa Melayu, which is the sort of hated school subject and very, very different from the vernacular, if you like.
Thank you. Very interesting. I want to thank you, Sarah, and I want to thank the other presenters, Jane, Sarah, Lina, and forgetting someone. We had also Marianne. Thank you so much for this interesting panel. I think you have greatly contributed to this academic discussion, and I invite you to continue with the rest of the program. Thank you so much for a perfect timing as well. Thank you for that, and for all the interesting questions and comments we had from the audience. I would like to take a picture of those of you who are still here. So if you want to open the camera, please. And I would like to take a screenshot. Okay, here we go. Thank you so much. Thank you very much. And see you around in other presentations. Bye-bye.
Really interesting to hear all of you. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.